The world of gravel bikes is set for another massive year. But what are going to be the key trends to look for? Joining us today is Nathan Haas, a World Tour pro turned gravel racer who is also a proper bike nerd and the winner of the most important race in cycling. That is the Tour of Britain. 2012, I think it was, Nathan. Also alongside me is Simon von Bromley, definitely not a winner of the Tour of Britain. Neither of us have really.
No, I haven't won the Tour of Britain.
No.
I haven't even won the Tour of the Mendips, Liam.
Oh, terrible. Without further ado, welcome Nathan.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Cheers for joining us.
Actually,
well,
Nathan.
do you know I'm the only winner of the Tour of Britain that never got a trophy or a jersey from it.
Really? Mm-hmm. Outrageous.
Would you like a jersey from the Tour of Britain?
We have a Jonathan Tiernan Lock Tour of Britain jersey just sitting next to us if you want that.
Well, I mean, that was the jersey that I kind of won. Not really sure how I feel about it, but...
Oh, yeah, of course.
That was that year, so I was second.
Liam, just stand up and grab it, show the camera. We've got to show you. That's ridiculous. That is such a strange coincidence.
Are you about to do a jersey presentation for Nathan Haas? Oh my God. Can someone please paint this on for me? We've got computer-generated stuff now. I should go into AI and be like, Nathan Haas wants Tiernan's jersey.
When we come to Girona for the tracker next year,
that's
outrageous.
That's a bit odd almost that you've got that sitting there. Was this a setup?
I promise. Sometimes,
I hadn't even considered that. Okay, all right.
Sometimes you think that TV is set up.
Yeah.
This was not.
Okay, all right. Well, funnily enough, we're not actually here to talk about the 2012 Tour of Britain. We're here today to talk about 2025 pro gravel race tech trends. And I think let's dive straight into it, Liam. What do you want to talk about first?
Yeah, Nathan, I think one of the key tech trends that I've seen this year that I think some brands have dripped it in, and I think that more brands will be jumping on this bandwagon, is massively wide gravel wheel rims. What do you make of these?
Well, it's interesting for sure, but in all things there's a limit, right? Bigger has definitely become better. Going from a 21 millimeter internal width to a 23, and then to a 25 internal width. There's been some really positive changes. But where does it become a negative change? Where does it actually tip to the other side and actually become detrimental? The question can be answered in kind of a few parts, right? And I think the first way to start it is to actually talk about an ice cream cone. I think it's a lovely metaphor for describing how tires actually sit on bike rims. So if you have your cone here and it's kind of a thin cone, and then you have your ice cream bubble on top, the ice cream can roll off that cone quite easily, right? So that's the downside to having a skinny rim, is that tire actually feels like it's going to roll. And that's one of the sensations that a lot of people get when you actually take an off-road tire on what is essentially a road rim, but onto the road. So you actually start to try to corner at speed on the road, but you get that sensation like the tire's actually just going to like pop off. And it's very scary.
I think this is really noticeable in cyclocross, isn't it? When you get a 33 millimeter cyclocross tub at like 10 psi or something stupid low, and it really feels like your bike is moving underneath you. The tire is kind of almost floating like one of those air people.
Yeah. Wavy inflatable man. But there is an advantage to it moving on top, and that's when we're actually off-road, right? Because we actually want that tire to actually be able to contour around the environment. When you're hitting rocks, roots and everything, you actually want it to be able to move, and that can actually be an advantage. But as soon as you get onto the road, all of a sudden you have this like tip rolling off problem, and you end up just getting all that negative feedback through the body from the bike, and then you end up braking, you end up going slower. So that's a bad thing. So all of a sudden we've now started to make that ice cream cone wider, and that ice cream is actually fitting almost like snug and inside. So in some scenarios that's better. A lot of the American races, they call them gravel races, but some of them have like 20% gravel at the most, right? So that's not really something that you need to think about optimizing the off-road part. People actually do this thing called underbiking, and they sort of make it more suited to the road aspect of the race as opposed to the gravel aspect of the race. I'm sorry if I'm speaking slowly here. I'm trying to gather my thoughts in a way that's actually going to be understood. One of the reasons that going for a wider rim is actually quite a nice thing is that now we've actually started to learn that skinnier tires are not necessarily faster than a wider tire. So if we want to have sort of that nice range between a tire that sits sort of like on top of or inside the rim, or a tire that's sitting like well on top of, which I actually think there's a sweet spot, which is there should be like a middle ground in that, is that internal rim widths need to be proportionate to the size of tire that you're riding. Because a 25 millimeter internal width, now if you're using a 55, which some people are, all of a sudden is going to give you that same sort of like funny effect. And when a tire is actually sitting more inside the cone, so to speak, your sidewalls are actually more exposed to getting more flats, and you're actually spending less time on top of the tread. And a tire that sits more on top and above, you're actually getting more time on top of the tread, so less flats in that sense. So your internal width needs to be proportionate to the tires in which you're choosing to run. So therein lies the next question. What is the fastest size for a gravel tire? I work with Waele, and they do a lot of testing on all of their tires, and they've easily proven now that the 45 millimeter tire is as fast, or if not faster, across all tread patterns than the 40 millimeter version. So we're starting to see now that there's actually benefits in having a wider tire. So depending on how you actually want your tire to sit in that rim, you need to now decide on what your internal rim width is proportionate to the fact that the kind of more modern thinking on tire choice for gravel is starting to go bigger. But then the next question on that is, what is too big?
Well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it's kind of getting interesting. And obviously, like one of the big releases recently has been Zip's kind of 303 XPLR, which has, I think, a 32 millimeter internal rim width, but it's kind of designed around. I believe I'm right in saying it's designed around. Is it a 40 millimeter tire? Because obviously they've designed that as a kind of aero wheel system. Right, but maybe like you say, on a gravel course where it's maybe only 20% gravel or something like that, then it's kind of like it's that maybe that in between of optimizing for both. But do you think we're likely to see, more wheels pushing that kind of extreme? Because I think until this wheel set released, we were kind of looking at 25 mil internal rim width.
That was mostly the maximum, wasn't it?
Do you think we're likely to see more of that?
There was a few 28s out there as well. Look, I think it's a super interesting product, but one of my biggest sort of concerns or question marks about it is like, who's that actually for? I know most people try to define gravel and what it is, but the reality is it's the undefinable. It's a little bit of a moot point for us to go over this again because it's the constant question and no one has an answer to it. Therefore, it probably doesn't have an answer. If you have an internal width that is pretty much locking you into a certain size of tire, at a minimum, that also restricts the type of riding that you can do. So I think that's a great product, but it's highly specific to wider tire choice. As I just said before, there's sort of the next question is, guys like Dylan Johnson and Keegan in the US have been using mountain bike tires now for gravel races, claiming that they're faster. But I actually think some of the science is flawed on how people actually test what is faster for a gravel tire. They're using a roller that's connected to a strain gauge, and that they get that roller going to 30 kilometers an hour or whatever the set speed is, and they measure the rolling resistance at that speed. And okay, some of the mountain bike tires now are rolling as fast as a 40 or a 45 mil tire on their sort of comparative grip patterns, so that they actually control the test. But the one thing that they don't actually take into account is the amount of energy it takes to get that tire to that speed. So now we're actually talking about how many kilojoules of energy it takes to actually accelerate from 0 or from 5k or 10k an hour up to 30. And for me, this is the biggest rate limiting factor of these wider tires, is that they actually take a hell of a lot more time to speed up. And people also forget that we're not in this perfect straight plane on a gravel bike all day long. When we're actually accelerating, most of the time we're actually tipping the bike because we're out of the saddle, which is actually engaging more of the side grip pattern as opposed to that smooth middle that they're testing. So that you're getting this huge bag of tire, which is creating a whole lot more friction, right? And it's also a heavier tire too. So, there's that secondary part of the tire, which is like how much rotational weight are we now adding to the bike, which when you get a bigger tire, it's actually like an exponential loss. So in Girona, Chad Hager and I, we've been doing a little bit of testing of our own. Chad's actually an engineer, so we tried to actually make it statistically as significant as we could with a small sample size. But we have this control climb that we do in Girona. It's called the San Miguel Challenge. We've made it a little bit of a fun competition in town. Anyone's welcome to come on Strava and try to take the record, but it's pretty up there now. But we've been doing some controlled tests. So we test on days where it's less than 5 kilometers per hour wind, so essentially no wind. It's also quite covered, so even if there is a little bit of wind, it virtually doesn't affect the time on the climb. And Chad Hager is also one of the masters of time trialing and effort control. So he did on his mountain bike tires, which were the same tires that Keegan raced at Unbound, so supposedly a very fast version and highly tested Maxxis tire. He took those up the San Miguel Challenge. He averaged 432 watts, and the normalized power was within 2 watts of that average, so it was a very smooth, controlled effort. And at the top, his time was 12:25. And then Chad went back and we did the test again a few days later. We waited for the right conditions. He did it on a 40 mil tire, and he did 434 watts, so 2 watts more. But the normalized was still within the same range. The wind was controlled. The weather was exactly the same. The course conditions were exactly the same. It was within a few days of each other. And he went 27 seconds faster up the climb, not on the mountain bike tire. So to me, sometimes the testing that they actually do in these theoretical environments doesn't actually apply to real life engagement and actually testing. And one of the challenges on this climb is there's actually quite a lot of switchbacks, and there's quite a lot of sections that get steeper and then it flattens out again. So it's about how you accelerate back up to speed and how much the mountain bike tire actually holds you back in those situations. A lot of riders have been bugging their bike manufacturers to go wide. I need to have these mountain bike tires. They're faster. I can corner better. I can go downhill better. But in reality, you're going to be pushing a lot more watts. And I should probably live by the saying of like never tell your enemy when they're making a mistake. but I think I hate bad science more than I want my competitors to have a disadvantage, because I think this trend that everyone is going towards mountain bike tires is wrong. I think it's based on poor decisions and poor communication of science and poor testing. And to me, when we come back to the internal rim width question, all of a sudden I see 25s being more than enough, right? Because I actually still think that 45s are the absolute maximum that we would need. And even though that the 45s theoretically roll as fast as the 40s, I still have the sensation that when I put a 40 mil tire on my bike, if I actually go to accelerate, I still feel faster on the 40s. And when I'm going into a more technical course, I have to use my technique not to flat. I don't need to rely on having a bigger tire that's more puncture resistant. That's also down to the rider. And this is one of the things that is, I think, sometimes misunderstood, is that there's a lot of technique in not getting flats and still going the same speed or faster. There's some riders who were riding the same tire brand that I was using 2 seasons ago. I think I had 2 flats in the whole season, and I think they were averaging 1 to 2 flats per race. And we were more or less the same weight, and both ex-professional road cyclists. I just had the mountain bike background, he did not. So I think sometimes technology is actually moving towards almost making excuses for people not having skills to make them feel more comfortable and stuff on the bike. But if we look at gravel from a racing perspective, this is, I would say, a negative evolution of the technology, to my opinion. However, for the masses of people that just want to enjoy riding their bike, have less flat tires, definitely have more grip going downhill, because a bigger tire with a different tread pattern, I would say 99% of the time definitely does go downhill better. So again, you always have to make it quite clear who you're talking about. What is the equipment actually meant for? Is it meant for the elite racer who's trying to win the biggest race in the world? Or is it meant for somebody who just wants to go out and enjoy gravel the best they can and race and compete and ride with their friends and stay as safe as possible? So some of the technology changes are definitely, I would say, a progression in what products suit a wider population of the cycling community on gravel, and which ones are still race bred. And I think the wider we're going with the rim width now, we're actually getting further away from race bred, in my opinion.
I think that's super interesting about the mountain bike tires, but we also saw the kind of opposite end of that scale, because Tiffany Cromwell, I caught up with her at the Gravel Worlds, and she lined up on road tires. And obviously she's on the Zip 303 Explore, which is a super wide rim, but she's still lining up to that gravel race on road tires, which I thought was a very brave move. And I think she had some punctures, but I would imagine for a course like that, that's where you're kind of going, really straddling the line between, do I need a gravel tire or can I get away with road tires?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll come on to kind of like, I think that's maybe a course specific thing, because, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about the UCI Gravel Worlds in a little bit. I did just want to come back to that testing you mentioned with Chad Hager, Nathan. I thought that was really interesting. Obviously, I think you mentioned it's a climb, and I do wonder whether, do you think the mountain bike tires in that test are specifically kind of, it's kind of not a bad test, but a kind of like they're disadvantaged by the fact that test is all uphill, because they're heavier.
Yeah.
Is it a weight thing? I mean, obviously, like, are there many gravel races that include, sustained climbs like that? I that's an open question. That's not a criticism. And is it more a case of like maybe mountain bike tires, as you say, they help people avoid punctures if you don't have as good skills? For someone like me, I'd be looking at that as an advantage, because obviously it's much harder to go out and become a incredible bike handler, like you said. So I wonder whether it's, and like Liam says there with, Tiffany Cromwell choosing slicks for certain races, it's kind of like there isn't maybe a one size fits all solution for everyone, but each racer needs to optimize for the kind of course, but also, as you kind of mentioned, their own skill set.
I would say well said there. I'm in hard agreement with everything you said. But to come back to the test, we actually think that's probably the most fair test there is to do, for the fact that the biggest rate limiting factor in a gravel race is the climbing. It's where I would say 99% of races are won and lost. But I would actually say more in gravel, it's where they're lost. People tend not to actually make attacks like they do on the road. Gravel is a little bit of a last person standing event. We don't hit speeds on the flat where sitting on the wheel can actually become challenging. So as soon as you're on the wheel at any speed that a gravel bike can actually do, if you have any energy left, that's not where you're getting dropped. On the downhills, depends where you race. If you race in the USA, there's very little chance that you're ever going to get dropped on a downhill because it's technical. I would say there's only one or two races in the USA that are challenging at all, technically. In Europe, that's almost the complete opposite. You have races like Houffalize, which is literally the old mountain bike World Cup downhill from the cross-country race. The tracker here in Girona is insane. Sea Otter here in Girona is insane. But to come back to the main point is that actually races are where you win and lose the race. So you need to actually become as efficient as possible on the climb. So if you're going to be losing 25 seconds just based on a tire choice, I don't care how good you are on a downhill, there's very few people that can close down 25 seconds to a group. I would prefer to be in the group and then managing myself on the downhill if I'm choosing my preference any single day of the week.
I think that's really interesting because that's the optimization for the actual race specific situation rather than the theoretical best.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, like obviously, like I've got more of a road background, and it's kind of like that thing of like, you pick a lightweight bike because obviously the climb is going to be the hard part, or do you pick an aero bike because you'll save energy in the run up to the climb? We've done like course analyses with people like Swiss Side and Aero Coach before, and Swiss Side and all the aero people are always so convinced that you pick the aero bike for the double ascent of Mont Ventoux because it saves you all that time on the downhill and on the flats and all that stuff. But obviously when we come to the race, that specific stage, Wout van Aert opted for the R5 and he won. Now that's, just because he won doesn't necessarily mean he made all the right choices, of course, because it's, Wout van Aert, one of the best riders in the world. Maybe he would have won no matter the setup. But it is a really interesting thing. And I think, as kind of Nathan's sort of saying here, you have to weight certain factors according to what you think matters, right? And so optimizing for those things, there's not just a case of like, oh, it's this definitively. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and
should we move on to
just to quickly bookend that is, you have to get out of the paradigm of thinking about it from a roadie perspective, because when Wout's going up Mont Ventoux, he's still going at speeds that aerodynamics are really a factor. So if you can have an optimized bike, you're actually getting, a rate of increasing returns versus a non-aerodynamic bike. But we do not climb at speeds in which aerodynamics is a factor. When we're on the flat, we're still not going at speeds that if you're on the wheel of a rider, you're actually being affected. And when we're going downhill, the biggest danger is actually going too fast and flooding or crashing. So aerodynamics, whilst it is a factor in gravel, it's not really how you would base your decisions. You're always basing your decisions on what is the hardest aspect of this course, and that will add hundreds of layers of questions on any course, which are sort of too much to actually discuss on a podcast without actually getting into the nitty-gritty of each course.
I like that.
Yeah,
I like that it's a bit more kind of nuanced.
Maybe in another episode, but I mean, maybe now's a good time to kind of segue and return to the whole kind of like the UCI Gravel Worlds thing. I think there was a lot of discussion, around that event, and obviously, no disputing that the winner is one of the finest bike riders in the world at the moment. But I wonder, Nathan, if you had an opinion on whether the kind of the UCI Gravel Worlds is gravel enough. And I know that's a very simplistic question, so feel free to kind of obviously answer it however you like.
How do you think I'm going to answer it?
I don't. To be honest, I don't know. I'm like, when I'm looking at YouTube comments, I saw a lot of people saying that people who didn't race it saying that it wasn't gravel enough. But my perception from what I saw was that it basically it was a really hard race, and it was a very kind of Belgian gravel race. So it was kind of raced like a spring classic, because that's the roads that they have. They don't have Kansas gravel roads to choose from, so they couldn't do that. So I to be honest, I don't know. I think everyone's kind of got a different opinion on it, and I'm not necessarily saying one's right or wrong.
I feel like it was probably quite difficult in its own way, because I've seen a lot of in-race footage from the likes of VC Let's Get It and kind of other content creators, and I think one of the issues was the number of riders that you had going on to relatively what would you would see, kind of think, oh, they're quite tame, but because of the volume of riders, because of the narrowness of the paths and some pinch points, they became incredibly selective in their own right. And you maybe got there as an athlete, rode the course and went, it's easy, and you maybe saw it on TV when the bunch had all strung out and it's just Van der Poel and a bunch of Belgians chopping through and off, and thought, well, this is quite tame. But I would imagine going through those sections, if you're 10-11 rows deep with everyone going absolutely mental, I would say they're very selective kind of in themselves, and they might just not have looked it.
Well, I think one of the comments that I always laugh at when people say, "Oh, it wasn't gravelly enough." It's like, are you seriously saying that a gravel rider would have done better against Mathieu van der Poel if it was more technical?
What I would like to see, I have to say,
wake up, man. He's a better bike handler than any of us on any day of the week, even if he was holding the handlebars with one arm, right? So, it's one of the grips that a lot of people always say, like when they didn't win a race, they go, "Oh, no, it was too much like a road race. I'm better at gravel races." It's like, so what you're saying is it was more about like fitness than skills. It's like, right. You could say that a little bit, but even if it was more about skills, Marianne Vos, Mathieu van der Poel, the two winners, will outride anybody in the gravel peloton on any day of the week, right? When it came to anything technical. So, all right, let's scrap that from an argument. It wasn't gravelly enough. Well, I would ask the next set of questions. Would you have used a road bike? Hell no. Would you have used a mountain bike? Definitely not. So quite literally, the definition of what this race is a gravel race, because the first bike that everybody would choose is a gravel bike, 100%. Then the next sort of factor to ask is, what do we see when we see the television coverage? We tend to see the slightly more open sections where they can actually get a motorbike through and the riders through. What we didn't see was all of these sectors that were, to be honest, they almost felt at that kind of speed in the bunch. They were actually too technical for a gravel bike in many ways, right? So to me, it was actually a wonderful course. I thought it was one of the coolest bike race courses that I've done. My only issue is that the UCI continues to disrespect the sport of gravel by calling this a UCI Gravel Worlds with how they rank all of the riders on the start line. I think someone showed me a statistic that it was like 26 of the top 30 riders actually started in the top 30 positions on the grid. And I believe 3 of those riders were gravel riders. They've now this past year, they've made a ranking with points from UCI gravel races. But the winner of the overall UCI gravel, who was Peter Vakoc, I think he was only ranked 9th on the grid at the UCI Gravel World Championships. Mountain bike points accounted at a much higher rate, I guess. How would be the best way to say it is one mountain bike point is weighted much higher than a gravel point, or they are much easier to come by because you score more mountain bike points for the same positions in a race. Same goes for road, same goes for cyclocross. And moreover, those points are added together. So gravel riders are at a distinct disadvantage. I was starting in like 80th or 90th position this year. And by 500 meters into the race, it was already gone. It had already split into groups on this hot dog corner. There were crashes, and it was like, well, now I'm here to have fun because I'm not actually in the bike race. So I think the UCI needs to wake up. And I think they need to actually also make rules that people have to have done a UCI gravel race to be eligible for World Championships. You can't just have a wild card position. We need to make the points fairer so that they're actually evenly weighted, or even more heavily weighted towards the gravel riders to actually make it, I would say, equitable for the fact that these World Tour riders are coming in and they have a completely different world of preparation to any gravel rider who's a pioneer can do. But then the second part of it is, what was I saying? There's the waiting. But then, I just think overall we need to start actually looking at this as a real sport and not just this thing that everyone can come and do. You need to have done a race, at least one race. You don't need to score points at the UCI race, but you need to come to a race. And not only is that something that feels more fair for the gravel riders when they're lining up against people who have never done a gravel race in their entire life. Like most of the World Tour riders at every single Gravel World Championships, it's literally their first gravel race they've ever done. But then if the UCI is actually smart about it, it actually helps promote the UCI races all around the world. Because if the World Tour riders and the mountain bike riders and the cyclocross riders who are famous, and everyone says, oh, it's fantastic because they're bringing all of this, fanfare and credibility to the sport of gravel at World Championships, wouldn't it be smart of the UCI to actually force those riders to have to go to some of the races all across the world all year? And it will actually also help the local promoters who are putting on these UCI races, who are paying a load of money to have the UCI letters on top of their banner. So I think that the UCI needs to consider a few more things to keep making the Gravel World Championships, I would say, fairer, and also making the Gravel World Championships something that's actually representing the sport that it is, because it's absolutely its own sport now.
Do you think that there's a few things that the UCI could do as well to the actual, I would say, kind of style of the event? So making it self-supported, making the courses longer. I feel like there's a bit of a skill gap. When I was knocking around the pits before the race and I saw the changes that you had made to your teammate, I think it was Juan Ayuso's bike, like, giving him CO2 canisters. Del Toro. Giving him CO2 canisters and all of that stuff. That is obviously skills in setting up your bike that you have picked up as a gravel racer. So I kind of feel like if you make it a bit more self-supported, you have to maybe get those UCI World Tour racers, mountain bikers, whatever, to learn those skills as well. And I think with gravel, being able to repair your bike and support yourself is part of the race, in my opinion anyway.
I agree wholeheartedly. A great person to speak to is Federico Damiani, who's the director of the Enough Gravel team. He has some very heavy opinions on this, which I mostly agree with. I think the distance of the course, it doesn't necessarily need to be longer. But the one thing that we both share as a feeling is that it's too World Tour, right? People are turning up in their team buses, cool. They have a nice warm place to chill out and hang out and get changed. We're still hiding behind trees, putting our nicks on, hopping out of the cars. I don't really care about that aspect, right? It's like, bring the setup you can. But the fact that they have people in every single feed zone and spare wheels in every single feed zone, it actually takes out a few of the quintessential skills of gravel, which is resource management. We actually have to think about how much food we can and want to carry for this portion of the race. And then you have to make a calculation of this portion of the race. Do you bring a hydration pack? Do you try to fit a third bottle in your back pocket for the start of the race and just drink that one first? Do we need to bring these tools? Or do we just rim bash it until the next feed zone that has a wheel, which in this case, I believe was every 4 to 5 kilometers. So you're actually taking out a huge part of what gravel really is, which is resource management, bike management, tool management, specific skills that you actually have to spend time learning. Like Isaac Del Toro didn't even know what a plug was. We had to get an old tire when we were at the Colnago Castle at the event. We actually had to get an old tire, put a screwdriver through it, and actually show Isaac how to do a plug for the first time. And for me, it was like, it was quite fun teaching him, right? Because he's just this like absolute phenom, gonna be superstar of cycling. And he's looking at me like, how do you know so much? And it's like, this is that, the delta between these two things. I would love to see it come a little bit more to the middle. I'm not saying we need no feed zones, but I think we could make it a little bit less of an advantage for people who have the resources to have 8 people around a course on a day. Because a lot of the people who are still coming to World Championships, Peter Vakoch or Paul Voss, it's probably still just their girlfriend in the feed zones. And they're driving around like a maniac in a place that they don't know, trying to get to as many zones and pits as they possibly can. So I think as a gravel purist, I would much rather the World Championships also evolve a little bit to just get away out from that, like get out of that UCI paradigm, which is the riders are useless fools and we need to support them in every sense of the way possible, and actually just say, let's empower the riders to learn how to manage their bike like a real bike rider. And I think that would make for a much cooler race, and it would also bring a whole bunch of riders up into that front group that might not be there otherwise, which I think for the dynamic of the race is pretty cool.
Did you see, this was my favourite bit of cycling tech for the whole year. Did you see Matt Holmes' prison phone?
He had a tiny, tiny little phone.
Which he claimed was designed for smuggling into prisons, and I'll leave you to imagine how they did that.
He had that just in case anything went wrong, he needed to be able to call someone.
Yeah,
right?
so like obviously Van der Poel and that, they've got so many helpers, but also they're at the front. You know, they get seen if they have a major issue, and they can probably get help. But, you know, for someone like Matt, maybe yourself, Nathan, a bit further, you know, down in the pack, I assume that if you have a problem quite away from a feed zone, it's just like, well, you know, try and get yourself... Yeah, if you can walk. You know, like so Matt Holmes had the smallest working mobile phone, and he showed me it did work, and I was amazed. But
it got it off Amazon or something.
Yeah, it's 20 quid or something.
You know what? It's a good point to make. We race with phones because we can be out in the middle of nowhere and we need help. We need a lift. We need a pickup. And I raced World Championships with a phone. And you know, that was something that Isaac was asking me, what do I do? And I said, well, what are you going to do if you get stuck out in the middle of nowhere, right? Because even in Belgium, you're still in the middle of nowhere. And unfortunately, he got crashed going into one of the bottleneck sections. And he got pushed into like a concrete barrier, and his bike snapped. It just absolutely imploded when it hit this like concrete pole. Cameron Mason tried to overtake him going into this little bottleneck, and in doing so, lost both of his wheels, crashed on the inside of Isaac and just pushed him literally straight into a wall, and his bike snapped.
Not something you can fix with a plug.
Unfortunately, I didn't prepare him for that.
Didn't he bring his gaffer tape?
But actually, I think there were 3 people who snapped their bikes in that same crash. Like, it was actually quite a big thing that happened. And I went past Isaac, and I just said, he didn't really know what to do, and I just said, stay there. And I actually contacted the guys from Colnago and told them where he was so they could go pick him up. So, you know, he was racing for the win without a phone, but it was lucky that I had one, because otherwise maybe he'd still be there. He wouldn't be back home in Mexico.
Sorry, I can only imagine Gabriele or Tommaso from Colnago turning up to find they're just like that new G4X, just like, oh.
No, that was honestly, I think that was like the most beautiful Colnago gravel paint job I've seen yet, with those silver decals on the Envy wheels. That was lush.
I mean, one of the so if you know, to put my kind of like UCI hat on, because you know I'm a big fan of the UCI Technical Regulations Rulebook. One of my favourite things to read and look out for fun updates.
Bedtime reading.
I think looking at this year's race, as you say, you know, with the types of riders that won, Marianne Vos and Mathieu van der Poel, the UCI will have been ecstatic and will have felt that this was a great success, because, as you say, they're 2 high-profile riders won, and I would imagine they don't really care whether it's fair on the people who are, you know, racing gravel day in, day out. I wonder if you think there's anything that the kind of, you know, like last year we saw Mohoric go race Unbound, for example, and, you know, had a bit of a tough time of it. You know, I would imagine we're not going to see Van der Poel at most gravel races showing off his kind of UCI Gravel World Championships jersey that often. But I wonder if you think there's anything that the gravel world could do to attract more of the big names in the sport, and so that, you know, when, as you say, when these World Tour riders turn up for UCI Gravel Worlds, it isn't their first event. Now, I know obviously, you know, a lot of these riders are going to have to basically do what their teams tell them to do, and they can't all be Van der Poel and get to decide their program. But do you think that there is, or is there anything these races can do to attract World Tour talent on a more regular basis?
Well, if we look at just the UCI races, they've already made these rules for cyclocross. You have to have done some races, right? Mm-hmm. And mountain bike, Pidcock started at the back at World Championships because he didn't get enough points in the year. So, it's not like the UCI hasn't done this already. It's just that they just don't quite respect gravel as a sport of its own. And I think the only way to actually build the UCI Gravel Series to be profitable is to make sure that the Gravel World Championships looks like it's a legitimate sport. So they don't really care about, in my opinion, they don't really care too much actually about the gravel specific side of it. Yet at the same time, they're trying to build the biggest business that they possibly can with the UCI Gran Fondo series. Keeping in mind that it's still called the Gran Fondo, right? Like it's not actually even really deemed as a gravel sport of its own. UCI has Gran Fondo for road, but then they also have road cycling. So I think even in the terminology, it's seen as a lesser than sport at this stage. Maybe that's going to evolve, but the truth is, the reality of gravel is that it's not the UCI series. They're good races, and we do them mainly to get points so that we can go to World Championships, because we still want to go race that race, right? And we love the fact that Van der Poel turns up. We want the fastest bike rider in the world on gravel to win. I don't think that there's any debate. The gravel riders, they love the fact that they actually get to ride against people that they've looked up to on the road for so long. Because a lot of riders in gravel aren't ex-professionals having had raced them. A guy like Jasper Oekelen, who's one of the best gravel riders in the world, he really looks forward to every year to actually have he feels like it's an honor to race against these guys and actually see how fast they are and how well he can go against them. But the reality of the real gravel racing is it's not UCI that people love the most. It's the class mark races. So that's Tracker, it's the Gravel Earth Series. It's Unbound, it's the Belgian waffle rides. This is real gravel, right? This is where those conditions actually are what we talk about. When we look at Steamboat, it's a fully self-supported race. Like, you have to stop in a feed zone if you want to fill up your own bottle. There's no one allowed to feed you anymore. So it makes it fair for people that don't have the money to actually bring out a whole support crew. Gravel is its own sport, and it's just totally not dictated by what the UCI is doing. So it's not that I think that the UCI is like a bad part of the sport. It's just a completely different line, right? Like, they don't converge, they diverge. And each year it feels like they're diverging further and further apart, because Gravel Earth Series is really becoming a thing. And then the UCI thing is really becoming its own thing. But they're both great, right? It is apples and pears, but they're both fruit. And I love eating fruit. Some days I like apples, some days I like pears. Simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, from our kind of perspective as in the media, gravel bikes are, consistently one of the most popular things in all of cycling. And so I think, I think everyone in cycling just kind of wants to see it succeed, in a commercial sense as well, because, heaven knows the sport's not like awash with cash. No. So, I guess, yeah, as you say, they're kind of converging in different ways, diverging and going in different ways. But it would be ideal if we could find a way for all of these, for it to become like cyclocross, like mountain biking, like road cycling, like a proper, very well commercialized discipline that offers, riders like a really good career, but also offers fans something, consistently good to watch, and everyone something, basically it becomes like a good product that we can sell, on the open market.
I think it has certainly got the most potential right now for commercial growth, towards what the road is. Nathan, I know that time is getting a bit tight, and I want to touch on a sensitive subject for many of our listeners, and that is suspension. Do gravel bikes need suspension?
Do we need the Tesla Cybertruck?
Well, I know my answer.
I don't know. Same. I don't have too many people firing bullets at me, but I mean, some people do. It's in a quantum state, right? Do road bikes need disc brakes? Do disc brakes make it easier to stop? 100%. Does suspension make it easier to go down technical stuff? Absolutely. But is there a cost right now for having suspension on a gravel bike? Yes, there's a massive weight cost. There's also a limited amount of stiffness that a suspension fork can still have. So just by its inherent design, there is a little bit more flex when you do have a suspension fork. And there's also a loss of power transfer in a non-locked out position. And in my experience, even a locked out position still tends to have a small amount of energy loss. I don't need to have a suspension fork, but would it help me in some scenarios? Yeah, definitely, right? Like it would be, like really helpful to have suspension in some places, but the cost for me as a bike racer is still too high right now. Let's say Rob Britton, he goes and does Badlands. On the other hand, he sees that the priority of just having less fatigue through his body and less chance of getting a flat when he's really fatigued and maybe not concentrating and not able to see the rocks. Because if you hit a rock and the suspension takes a lot of the impact, it takes a lot of the stress off the tire. So he used suspension fork at Badlands. But I wouldn't want to use a suspension fork for a 4 to 5 hour race in which my body can actually handle all of that extra load and compression. Forks like the Lauf fork, that's quite an interesting thing. I don't know if you know much about the Lauf fork, but it doesn't add very much weight. But it also doesn't work the same exact way as a traditional stanchion fork does. So to answer your question, I can't answer it because I'm very pro people having suspension fork if they want to have it. Like it definitely makes a bike ride differently. But on the other hand, gravel bikes, their geometry is also specifically made for a specific head angle. And as soon as you add a suspension fork, you're adding 30 to 40 more mil of lift. And how do you account for that when it comes to the fact that bikes, generally speaking, a lot of R&D goes into the geometry of the bike to be ridden with a fork with a particular stack height. So is there another bit of a loss there? Perhaps. Maybe a bike without a suspension fork and good technique can actually be ridden better. But it's not my place to say what people do with their bikes. Like I'm never going to buy a Cybertruck, but I don't judge someone who does.
Well, maybe we do, but just to return to the Lauf fork, for those who aren't aware, we'll put a little picture of it up on screen. But instead of having, as Nathan says, traditional stanchions, it basically uses kind of like a leaf spring design, and it has kind of like carbon leaf springs, and so it's a kind of technically a rigid fork with I think around 20 millimeters of travel.
I think it's more in the region of 30. I mean, this is the fork that really changed my view of suspension in gravel. For a bit more of a punter, someone that rides a bit more kind of adventure riding in my local area, because we just don't have much gravel around here. It really transforms the bike, and it's, I think, a good thing for a bit more kind of gnarly gravel, but maybe not for racing.
I think from my again, like, I know Nathan's already said I need to stop thinking about it from a roadie perspective, but I'm not going to. I think from my perspective, like I like the simplicity of like a gravel bike that doesn't have, this is why I'm not into mountain biking, because I don't like to, when all the mountain bikers here at BikeRadar start talking about sag and like all of this stuff, like
that's the only word you know.
My eyes just glaze over. It's the only suspension word I know.
Yeah,
my eyes just glaze over, and I like the fact that a gravel bike is like simplistic, like a road bike. Now, Nathan, I kind of guess I already know your answer to this, because you said you don't judge people who want to make different choices to you. But one of the things that the UCI does in cyclocross, for example, is that they limit tire sizes to 33 millimeters. Do you think you'd ever want to see? Obviously most people are always like, oh, we should get rid of rules, but would you ever want to see rules brought into gravel that kind of limited tire sizes or said, no suspension or things like that? And, do you think there could be a benefit to anything like that? Or do you think it should be basically, anything goes and people are kind of, a bit like triathlon, within a certain kind of a vague set of rules, people are free to, choose whatever they like?
I think I've swayed between my thought on this. And I think it's always a good thing when people can have their opinions changed, right? Because I have strong opinions, but I hold those opinions very loosely. And that is to say, if someone shows me that there is a better reason or a better way of something being, then I will change my mind. The first time I really thought about having a minimum tire size for a gravel bike was when we did the first Gravel World Championships, which really was on a bike path. And guys like Van der Poel and a lot of the riders just used road bikes. And for me, that kind of, that ground my gears a little bit, because I was like, how is that helping the gravel industry?
Yeah.
Right? It's like,
yeah, I think Gianni
like,
Vermeersch won on a Canyon endurance
with 35
mil tires, maybe.
Like that.
So, and it sort of just begs the question of like, when does it actually start to become a gravel bike? But then my mind sort of changed a little bit, because I think, Paul Voss at the Europeans last year, he actually beat Vermeersch in a sprint to get second or third place. And he used the same tires as Tiffany Cromwell did at World Championships, the Schwalbe 32 or 33 mil road tire, because he could actually accelerate on the road sprint. And he chose that setup knowing that he was going to lose a lot technically on the downhills and have traction issues on the climb, but he favored his ability to ride gravel better than these riders can on a gravel setup, knowing that he just needed to be there for the sprint at the end to be able to beat them. And he used the advantage of having a slick road tire, to beat Vermeersch, who's a fantastic sprinter, in a sprint. And with all due respect to Paul, he can't kick his way out of a wet paper box. So he actually used a really risky bike choice to get him into a situation that he got the best result of his probably cycling career. To actually get a medal at a European Championships against the world's best riders was enormous. And I think everyone in the gravel community had a real sense of pride for Paul's ride that day. It really made us feel like, okay, that there is an equitable level here if we really get our day perfect. So I kind of like the fact that riders get to take risky choices, whether they've overbiked or underbiked or chosen the wrong gear ratios or chosen a bike that's too heavy because they've got suspension. I say the less regulation in gravel, the better. Like this is a safe space as well for bike brands to actually push the limits of what is possible on a bike. Every time we restrict, all of a sudden what we're doing is we're pretty much saying like, R&D, get in line, as opposed to think out of the box. And I think for mountain biking, a lot of technological changes have actually come from mountain biking because they can do whatever the hell they want, within a reason. But there's so few regulations that they actually get to do cool things. Like, Cannondale lefty fork, for example. Like, why do we still have two arms on a fork on a road bike? We'd cut down the CDA by like a half if all of a sudden we got rid of that regulation. And if it can be done on a mountain bike fork that goes off drops and jumps, pretty sure we know that the hub can actually handle that kind of force. A road bike's never going to produce the same amount of force that a mountain bike going downhill does. So I think the less regulation, the better. Like, let's let it rip. Let's see what bikes can become in the gravel space. Let's not hold it back.
Wicked. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. Like, I also think, because I've always wondered why UCI has a 33 mil tyre limit for cyclocross anyway. I know, obviously, it comes to a point where if you let people use whatever they want, presumably they'd have to make the cyclocross courses harder.
You'd run into all sorts of difficulties with it basically being a sprint gravel race. Yeah. I think it would transform into. But right now, cyclocross bikes are pretty much pointless.
Same,
like, why as a punter would I buy a cyclocross bike to race my local cyclocross races when at my local cyclocross races they don't measure your tires? So I'll just buy a gravel bike. And
so you admitting to cheating live on the podcast, Liam?
It's not cheating. So in so many words.
Yeah. Okay.
But in terms of like brands that basically produced cyclocross bikes, I'm thinking like Stevens and brands like that. They've basically got to now go and make a gravel bike and things like that, because otherwise, like, their cyclocross bikes, okay, so their pro riders are going to use them, but I'm not sure how many brands are, how many in-flights does Canyon sell compared to the Grail, I wonder?
Yeah, probably not that many. Well, all right, Nathan, I think we should probably let you go soon. But looking forward to next season, kind of what are your big goals, and do you have any kind of like tech secrets up your sleeve that you might be able to share with us?
I'm working on a bike that I think will make a bit of noise for next season. I'm not going to give anything away. Not at this point. I want to make as much noise as I possibly can, but I just think that the one piece of tech that's actually really going to change gravel going into the future is I don't work with them, so this is not a sponsor plug. You can't even get them yet because I don't think that they're actually production ready. But I think the thing that's really going to change the game and totally remove the conversation about, what tire pressure are you running, what tires are you running, is Gravaa. This is like the biggest jump in bike tech since we found disc brakes or found, wireless shifting. This is huge. The fact that I could maybe bring my tires down to 15 PSI for technical downhills, and then when I get onto the road, put it up to 50 PSI, and find anywhere in between for, different parts of the course. And then if I start getting a slow leak flat, I'm using my own power. There's not a battery inside that thing. It's actually using your bike like a dynamo to actually pump your tire up and to keep air in it. I think one of the biggest future developments for a racing circumstance anyway, I don't know how it applies necessarily to a recreational rider, but for racing, Gravaa is going to change the game. So I think that's going to be something that we see from a tech side really evolve. And for the wheel brands who are agnostic to the hub use, I think it's going to be an exciting time for them as well. As people start to really get into that product, I think Gravaa is going to be a pretty exciting new thing to jump onto the scene, and I'm hoping to get my hands on one as soon as they're available to the public.
You should just ask Mariana if you can borrow hers. I'm sure she'd be chill with it.
Yeah. I've already won one race. You're only as good as your last gravel race. Here's my wheel.
Slightly used.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that's a super interesting bit of technology. Obviously, again, we'll pop a little picture of it up on screen, but as Nathan says, it's basically a device that allows you to adjust the tire pressure as you're riding, and it kind of, it uses the kind of, like a dynamo, uses your forward momentum to kind of power that. We'll pop a link in the description where you can, read our news story. And actually, you covered it at the UCI Gravel World, didn't you, Liam? So maybe people should check out that video. Yeah,
absolutely. We also first saw it, I think, at Paris-Roubaix, and that broke the internet a bit. Currently quite expensive, 4,000 euros, something like that for a full system with with your rims. But
I don't even know if that's...
SRMs were expensive.
I think that's a theoretical price because you still can't buy them, right? So, maybe that changes when they actually hit production. And
true. That's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think technically, if they've been raced in the UCI scene, they should technically be available for sale.
Oh yeah.
But
we see that all the time.
UCI rules, hey.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Right. I think we will wrap it up there. Nathan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for a fun chat.
Yeah, cheers, Nathan. That was super interesting.
And I'll send you my address for that jersey, yeah?
Perfect. Yeah. I was just about to say. Well, that was a fantastic conversation, and Nathan obviously has a lot of technical knowledge. If you agree with any of his points, let us know down in the comments. And if you disagree with them, definitely go and let us know down in the comments. If you want to see all of the bikes from the tracker, well, that's just floating around above our heads. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.